the depiction of the Jew more or less ended here, I would actually argue that this is the beginning, at least for tonight's lecture. And it is only Shakespeare who can take us, his audience, anywhere from here. So in my title, I mentioned the term new mimesis. How many of you knew there was an old mimesis? How many of you know what mimesis is? Okay, so here is a brief breakdown of a quite complicated concept. Mimesis, the old school version. It's a representation of an imitation, or sorry, a representation or imitation of the reality in art. So it is a painter painting the sunrise, right? That painting is mimetic. And this image of a Jew is a mimetic, old school mimetic representation. So I hope to show you today Shakespeare's new mimesis that grasps reality in a whole and rather than imitating, it emulates. So it emulates reality by asking the audience to reinterpret it and draw their own conclusions. While old mimesis focuses on the artist's understanding and interpretation, new mimesis requires the audience's understanding and interpretation. So what I'm going to show you over the course of this brief lecture is 3 representations of the Jew on stage. We are going to look at Croxton's play of The Sacrament, written in 1491, which represents the caste system in medieval Europe. Social rules were God-given and permanent. There was no real concept of time, of future, of history, not that we would subscribe to today. There was an ordained present. The Jew in a medieval morality play had no further meaning to it. I say it quite intentionally because the Jew was more of an adversary or an obstacle than anyone resembling a human. I'm going to give you the briefest rundown of the Croxton play of The Sacrament. Christian merchant Aristorius says that he won't sell the sacrament for even 100 pounds. He then sells the sacrament to the Jews for 100 pounds. The Jews, in an attempt to discredit Christianity, reenact the crucifixion. Then the sacrament begins to bleed. Then, because we're looking at something that already is the body of Christ as the sacrament, it becomes what it already is. And so the Jews freak out, right? The sacrament became Jesus. Can't blame them for that one. They repent and they convert to Christianity, and that's the end of the play. It's a fun. So now we're going to talk about Jew of Malta. In 17th century, Thomas Hobbes wrote a description of the state of nature: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Welcome to Christopher Marlowe's 1589 production of the Jew of Malta. I don't think anything could sum it up better. So Malta is this place that is supposedly full of knights that are full of honor and religious purity. And Marlowe shows us a dramatic landscape literally and literarily absent of God. As Calymath, a Turcan prince, comes to Malta in order to claim payment for the land, Farnese, governor of Malta, goes to the Jews to collect money. When Barabbas tries to present this, Farnese takes everything from him and turns his house into a nunnery. The rest of the play is filled with Barabbas wreaking havoc on everyone, and everyone else betraying everyone else. As Hobbes says, it's a war of all against all. It ends with the audience laughing as Barabbas is boiled alive center stage. Again, another fun play. We will then look at a large shift that happens in a very few years. So we're looking to William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, written in 1596. It is here that we will find a state of personhood. Oh, you can do it. Aha. Okay. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, Harold Bloom, in his book Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, states that our supposed advances in cultural anthropology are not advances upon Shakespeare. He is suggesting that Shakespeare's techniques go way beyond the received techniques of stagecraft in his time. Shakespeare not only created new words, some people approximate around 1,700 of them, but new methods of conveyance on the stage. He invented a new way to see humanity and to be human. What Bloom didn't say, but I will, is that Shakespeare also invented the modern Jew beyond the stereotypes. So in Merchant of Venice, we see two plays in one. You might even call it a Christian play, which is The Merchant of Venice, and the Jewish play, which is The Jew of Venice, its original title. In the Christian play, Bassanio comes seeking funds from Antonio to seek the very wealthy woman of his dreams. Antonio, having no funds, offers himself as collateral for Bassanio to take out a loan from Shylock. After getting that loan, Bassanio goes to win Portia's hand. In the Jewish version of this play, Shylock and Antonio are not friends. So Shylock says, and yes, I am paraphrasing and bastardizing, bear with me. Sure, I'll give you money, and I don't want any interest, but if you forfeit the bond, you owe me a pound of flesh. This sounds like a great deal, right? But it ends in Christian victory. Antonio gets back all of his wealth, and everyone gets married, including the conversion and marriage of Jessica, Shylock's daughter, but excluding Antonio, who may well be gay and be in love with Bassanio. And Jewish tragedy. Shylock loses his daughter, his wealth, his livelihood, and his community as he is forced to convert to Christianity. Okay, that's all we have time for in terms of summary. I hope you will go read Merchant of Venice, go read or see The Jew of Malta. You can skip play the sacrament. All right. So back to it, shall we? What does it mean to invent a human, or more specifically, a Jew? As Europe moved from the medieval caste system to an early modern class system, the theater and Shakespeare created an opportunity for social identity beyond religious identity. Due to today's time constraints, we will only focus on what Shakespeare himself invented within a destabilized society: personhood. Implicit in Harold Bloom's pronouncement at the very title of his book, which situates the invention of the human on Shakespeare's stage, is a reconception of what is meant in the notion of being a person. In defining suffering and the goals of medicine, physician and bioethicist Eric Cassell catalogs a thorough but not exhaustive list, a provisional scheme of the characteristics of personhood. Persons, Cassell says, have personality and character, a lived past, a family's lived past, culture and society, roles, associations with others, a political dimension, activities, day-to-day behaviors, an existence below awareness, a body, a secret life, a believed-in future, and a transcendent dimension. This is the list that I'm going to use to look at the depictions of Jews in each of these plays and to demonstrate the evolution that takes place on the stage. I will be focusing specifically on personality and character, a secret life, family, a believed-in future, a transcendent dimension. One characteristic that Cassell does not mention, but I will because I'm an English professor and an early modernist, is language. That one's an important one for me. So my beginning point, it seems self-evident to me, and I hope it will become so for all of you, is that representation in general and the representation of Jews on the Elizabethan stage in particular drastically altered in Shakespeare's time. So what changed? What changed, as I've already suggested, is the nature and basis of social relationships conditioning the nature of the audience, and beyond the nature and work of the audience. So the medieval audience was an audience that was being told, that was being taught, that was being preached to both from pulpit and stage and, as we see here, pageant wagon. The idea of salvation was more or less self-evident. Individuals were saved or doomed, and priests had the power to alter that condition. If we're to, excuse me, if we are to believe the ability to buy indulgences. There were no secrets, so there was no need to read the play, to interpret its actions or infer its more or less hidden meanings. We can see this in Croxton's play, The Sacrament. The Jews are the self-evident Christ killers. Performed at the end of the 15th century, the play of The Sacrament, written by an anonymous playwright, complicates the Christian victory, admittedly without any subtlety. There is no attempt on the playwright's part to humanize his 5 Jewish characters because these characters are only and they are self-evidently Jews. There is no inductive agenda of developing classification, no mimetic agenda of grasping inferred meanings. Everyone in the play of The Sacrament performs their ordained roles. Moreover, it is altogether fitting that this play has an anonymous playwright, since its truths need only to be articulated to be apprehended as true, and this was a story known by all. It was, in a sense, a story told by all and belonging to none. Personality and character. When Cassell begins with personality and character, he begins with what Shakespeare taught us to see. This catalog doesn't work in a pre-Shakespearean world because in that world, identity is dependent on religion and religiously sanctioned politics. That is, a caste system. And there was an absence of any sense of a believed-in future beyond day-to-day behaviors and bodily existence below awareness. There is no place for a secret life in a caste system that makes everything visible, and no place for a transcendent dimension where priests hold the keys to heaven. Thus, in the player list of the play of The Sacrament, the Christians are identified by name or occupation, while the Jews are numbered 1 through 5, suggesting that they exist below awareness, interchangeable in identity. This is an absolutist society. Absolute authority is conferred by God to priests and kings. These absolute authorities, as ordained by the voice of God, then determine the identity of others. In this fixed social structure, there is no opportunity to be other than who or what one has been assigned to be. This changes with Marlowe's Barabbas and the Jew of Malta, as Barabbas is given many roles, but without personality or character. It's merely a list. As for myself, I walk abroad at nights and kill sick people groaning under walls. Sometimes I go about and poison wells. After that, I was an engineer and slew friend and enemy with my stratagems. Then, after that, I was a usurer. Okay. There is no motivation. There is no explanation. He does because he is. It is his nature. But what he is not one thing. Rather, he's in a position to take on social roles almost as at will. Not nice roles, but social roles. A position virtually impossible in a caste system. For Shakespeare's Shylock, we see roles and personality. Shakespeare is not villainous for villainy sake. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, why should his sufferance be by Christian, or what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why revenge? The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. Shylock's flesh and blood has been stolen from his house. Lorenzo took his daughter Jessica. Shylock then copies the acts of his opponent in his crusade to steal Antonio's flesh. He is duplicating the first offense. Shakespeare is emphasizing mimetic violence between the Jew and the merchant. Shakespeare gives Shylock cause for his hatred. Antonio disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated my enemies, and what's his reason? I am a Jew. Rather than Marlowe's Barabbas, who does what he does because he's a Jew, albeit of many faces, Shylock is instead responding to how Antonio and the other characters in the play treat him as a Jew. We see a man who has both friends and enemies. He's socially engaged. And while he might not be the warmest and fuzziest of Shakespeare's characters, His beliefs and emotions are always in play, always discernible by an attentive audience. In the play of the sacrament, there is no secret life. Indeed, the story pre-exists the performance, as we, the audience, are told the story before the play even begins by two speakers identified as vexillators, banner bearers in a miracle play. Wish that was louder.
Sovereigns, and I'd like you to hear the purpose of this play that is represented now in your sight, which in Aragon was done, the soft to say, in Heraclea, that famous city, all right. Therein, one of a merchant of metal might, Sir Aristotle was called his name. And unto him there came a Jew with great riches for the nuns, £20, and merchandise more, he proffered for the holy sacrament. This Christian merchant consented, the soft to say, and in the night after made him deliverance. These Jews all great joy made they, but of this betime stranger chance. They grieved our Lord greatly on ground, and put him into a nude passion, with daggers given many a grievous wound. Nailed him to a pillar, and with pitsons plucked him down. And then they put him to a new tormentory. In a hot oven speared him fast. There he appeared, with wounds bloody, the oven roof asunder and all to breast. Thus, in our law, they were made steadfast. The holy sacrament showed them great favour. In contrition, their hearts were cast, and went and showed their lives to the confessor.
So that's the entire play. That's it in like a minute and 30 seconds. So I told you, you're not missing much. So it's the articulation of a story that everyone already knew, because remember, in a caste system, there are no secrets. The Jews of Play of the Sacrament are forcibly, if willingly, converted, but otherwise unscathed for their reenactment of the crucifixion, which was performed by stabbing and nailing the sacrament upon a board. Saving the Jews by conversion after their repetition of the same acts that originally defined them as Christ killers clearly represents the victory of the Christians over the infidels, the outsiders. And it functions well when when identity is tied up with social religious formations. God-given prelates, the social world of church-going, a sense of religious identity takes precedence over local and thereby fragile political identity. But when politics begins to rival religion, as it does for a host of reasons in Tudor England, the fragile nature of religion becomes increasingly evident. Nope, we don't watch it again. We watched it once. We're good. No, don't make me watch it again. Okay. All right. So in his biography of Shakespeare, Will and the World, Stephen Greenblatt focuses on the atmosphere that arose from the religious conflict in a chapter aptly named The Great Fear. Greenblatt describes the bloody power shifts in early modern England from Catholicism to Protestantism, back to Catholicism, and of course, back to Protestantism, which he refers to as a nightmarish sequence of conspiracy and persecution, plot and counterplot. In none of these regimes was there a vision of religious tolerance. Each shift was accompanied by waves of terror, rack and thumbscrew, axe and fire. From Henry VIII's establishment of the Protestant Church in 1534 to Elizabeth's reestablishment of Protestantism in 1558, the country has gone through multiple conversions of faith, political rebellions, and bloodshed on both sides of the Protestant Catholic divide for heresy or following the wrong religion at the wrong time. Indeed, the politics of monarchical instability bled, literally and metaphorically, into religious instability. Whereas these were now the new foundations of politics. All this to say, the world was no longer devoid of secrets, secret acts, secret alliances, secret beliefs. In fact, in order to survive, this new world necessitated secrets, spies, and hidden meanings in words. So that brings us to the 16th century and an economy of secrets. So Daniel Jute defines all activities that involve trading, offering, negotiating, delivering, exchanging, and buying secrets. And this revolved around intelligencers or spies emerged in the forms of courtiers, diplomats, messengers, and merchants. It offered those in lesser positions, occupational or social mobility, built not upon beliefs, but built upon opportunities to convert knowledge into power. Even Barabbas's name figuratively conveys a not-so-secret secret. Let's look at George Herbert's 1633 poem, Self-Condemnation. Thou who condemnest Jewish hate for choosing Barabbas a murderer before the Lord of glory, he that doth love and love amiss, this world delights before true Christian joy, hath made a Jewish choice. This poem exemplifies the concept of adversus Judaeos, the Judeo-Christian comparison to show the damnation of Jews in order to demonstrate the superiority of Christians. But more importantly for us, it demonstrates the connection made between a Jewish choice and Herbert's Christian audience that love this world delights before true Christian joy. Herbert uses the Jew villain, specifically personified as Barabbas, as a placeholder to showcase the villainies of his Christian community. Marlowe does the same, and he uses the exact same name. Barabbas is recognized by many, but known by none. He continuously distinguishes himself from the Jewish community in Malta. Barabbas accuses the Jews, "You were a multitude, and I but one. And for me only have they taken all." Barabbas is the Jew rather than a Jew, a part of the multitude. He is emphasizing the difference between himself and the Jewish people. I agree with David Bevington's assessment that it would be an error then to sympathize with Barabbas as a representative victim of a downtrodden race, since his ill will applies equally to Christian, Turk, and Jew. In fact, I suggest that Barabbas's title is not meant to connect him to any religious group or downtrodden race, but ultimately to separate him from every group represented on that stage. It is as if Barabbas does not possess Cassell's personhood. Rather, he seems a cipher, reflecting various roles. So, the title Jew is a construction just like every other identity that Barabbas assumes. As he encounters the Jewish community of Malta, Ferniz, Calymath, and even his daughter, he constructs a mirror to reflect that individual's desires. The only time we see Barabbas in an affectionate capacity is when he is reflecting the affections of his daughter. Surrounded by Jewish men, this is the only time we see Barabbas take part in religious discussion. When Barabbas comes in contact with Calymath, we see him take on Calymath's own desire for power and transform himself into a spy, a secret weapon, a construction that is transformed to fit Ferniz's needs almost as soon as Calymath walks off the stage. His identity shifts depending on the party addressing him. After the fall of Malta, the audience hears Ferniz address Barabbas as traitor and unhallowed Jew, while in the next lines, Calymath bids a Jew to a brave Jew. Farewell, great Barabbas. Marlowe set up a clear juxtaposition. Every character has seen a different version of the Jew. Shylock, by name alone, carries a secret that is more personal, more human, I might say, than shiftings of Barabbas's social positions. While the term Jew clearly isolates Shylock as other, his proper name also differentiates him from the rest of the cast. Shylock is the only English name used in The Merchant of Venice. As Stanford Shakespearean Stephen Orgel points out, the name Shylock has been in circulation since Saxon times, and this native surname still exists today. this name would have been as familiar to an English audience as the Sherlock we all know. But there is another darker secret in the passages of The Merchant of Venice. First produced in 1598, The Jew of Venice, as it was originally titled, was produced at the same time as a resurgence of The Jew of Malta. If we look at the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice, we might see why. Graziano, one of Shakespeare's fools, which as any Shakespearean knows, we should pay particular attention to the fools. He spouts words of loathing at Shylock as Shylock demands payment of his bond, a pound of Antonio's flesh. Graziano says, "Oh, be thou damned, inexorable dog. Thy currish spirit governed a wolf who hanged for a human slaughter. Even from the gallows did his fell soul fleet. For thy desires are wolvish, bloody, starved, and ravenous." Later, when the tides turn against Shylock, we see Graziano ask again and again for the hanging of Shylock. So what do we make of Graziano? One of Shakespeare's fools, usually the paragon of insights and wisdom, playing this bloodthirsty role. We have to look at the 4 references to the wolves in this scene. The Latin for wolf is lupus, which I contend, in conjunction with the trial scene and numerous allusions to death by hanging, is an allusion to the 1594 execution of Queen Elizabeth's physician, Rodrigo Lopez. Lopez meaning wolf. But unless you know your Latin, the secret remains secreted in the text. Lopez's tale ends after Graziano suggests, its tale ended as Graziano suggests Shylock should. They were all of them condemned, and after 3 months put to death at Tyburn, Lopez affirming that he had loved the queen as he loved Jesus Christ, which, from a man of the Jewish profession, was heard not without laughter. Lopez had gone from a part of the London community to a foreigner, a spy, a poisoner, and in all of these ways, a Jew. So, what could come from secreting another trial, this other Jew, into Shakespeare's text? Rather than simply imitating the trial and the execution of Lopez, Shakespeare theatrically emulates it, inventing new meaning and a new way for the execution of Lopez to be read. And maybe we have an audience that is no longer laughing. Too far. So Lopez was killed in isolation. He wasn't a husband. He wasn't a father, a man. He was a Jew. He was dehumanized until, like Barabbas, he could be killed in front of so many to the sounds of laughter. But Rodrigo Lopez was husband to Sarah Aines and father to 6 children, 2 daughters and 4 sons. All of that was stripped from the narrative. The same is seen in Croxton's play of The Sacrament. There is no mention of family or even life beyond the goal of proving Christianity false. In Marlowe's Jew of Malta, Barabbas has a daughter, Abigail, but she is only utilized as a tool to get what he wants. Everything and everyone in Malta has a price. Referring to the sale of slaves at a market, an officer states that everyone's price is written on his back. But this nonchalant sentence applies to every character in the play. While slave shopping, Barabbas and Lodwick, Fernice's son, discuss the value of Barabbas's daughter, Abigail, using the code word diamond. Barabbas is all too willing to sell his daughter for the right price. In Merchant of Venice, Shylock also has a daughter, Jessica, and there's also reference to a loss of his wife, Leah. When he finds out that his runaway daughter traded a ring, a gift from his late wife, for a monkey, Shylock grieves. "It was my turquoise. I had it of Leah when I was a bachelor. I would not have given it for a wilderness of monkeys." Unlike Barabbas, who is willing to sell anything for the right price, we can see the familial bonds are actually articulated as invaluable by Shylock. Shylock's relationship with Jessica is seen as tumultuous and torturous for her. He is controlling and protective. But these become more reasonable and human responses if considered in conjunction with the loss of his beloved wife and his loss of his daughter, This drives him mad. This idea of family connects to the believed in future required for personhood. Family is one element of future tense, not just what is, but the possibility of what can be. As we have seen, there was no future for the pre-modern caste system because there was no possibility beyond the role one was born with. What you were was what your children would be. In Barabbas, occupationally, we see the possibility of movement, a spy. Barabbas could use his knowledge to attain power and value. However, his idea of future is limited as he is willing to kill his own daughter, his own future, because she disobeys him and converts to Christianity. His future is limited to self. For Shylock, we see a different vision of future. Even as his daughter has left him, left the Jewish faith, he maintains that he has a daughter. His daughter is an extension of his future self. Moreover, he is rightfully alarmed at the Christian mechanisms for future success demonstrated by Bassanio and Graziano in the trial scene. Rather than offer themselves, Bassanio and Graziano offer up their wives, who are dear to me as life itself. They offer a sacrificial substitution. So Bassanio pledges to Antonio, I am married to a wife, which is as dear to me as life itself. But life itself, my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above thy life. I would lose all, I sacrifice them all, here to this devil to deliver you. That's nice. Shylock is alarmed by these offers, responding, these be the Christian husbands? I have a daughter. Would any of the stock of Barabbas have been her husband rather than a Christian? He hasn't cast off his daughter, as he's often portrayed. He is terrified for her because he sees her future, the willingness of self-proclaimed Christians to sacrifice not themselves, but others for what they deem moral. We see Portia, Nerissa, and Shylock all questioning the willingness of these men to sacrifice their families. Shakespeare is literally putting the sacrificial structure center stage. The difference between self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of the vulnerable figures of one's community as represented by Portia, Nerissa, Shylock, and Rodrigo Lopez. René Girard specifically acknowledges Shakespeare's use of multiple meanings and audience interpretation in scapegoating techniques. As a dramatic strategist, Shakespeare deliberately resorts to the power of scapegoating. During much of his career, he combined two plays in one, deliberately channeling different segments of his audience toward two different interpretations of one and the same play. A sacrificial explanation for the groundlings, which perpetuates itself in most modern interpretations, and a non-sacrificial mimetic one for those in the galleries. Many scholars since the work of Girard a generation ago have assumed that the scapegoating of outsiders is built into the structure of human societies. Girard organizes his analysis around the scapegoating of Christ. I have two issues with Girard. One is that he uses a caste system to differentiate between the audience and the galleries, and the groundlings to understand Shakespeare's techniques. I would argue that Shakespeare makes no such differentiation, which I'll elaborate more on shortly. The second issue is the organization of scapegoating around the crucifixion. Jesus sacrificed himself. Scapegoating sacrifices another in place of or for the benefit of the self or group, as we see Bassanio heroically offering up Portia. Here, I argue, is where we see Shylock's disbelief and the reason for his reference to Barabbas, the prisoner who was chosen by the Jews instead of Jesus to be released. Girard is of the opinion that Shakespeare is imitating the structure of scapegoating, that after the execution of Jesus' sacrifice, it became ritualized rather than sacrificial. Shakespeare is playing it out on stage. Instead, I argue that Shakespeare is emulating the structure in order to demonstrate the transitive nature of sacrifice, a verb that by definition requires an object and is always, even on the stage, an act of violence. In terms of transcendence, the application to the play of the sacrament is fairly straightforward once again. The Jews go to the bishop to confess, repent, and convert. Transcendence is completely dependent on religious authority. While the characters in religiously driven play The Sacrament reach some form of salvation, in 1589, there is no religious salvation for Marlowe's characters. In fact, there is no God in Malta. The very word is absent from the text. Barabbas hides his treasure, his salvation, under the sign of the cross. He tells Abigail, as he sends her into the nunnery that was once their home, the board that marked thus, that covers it. Obviously, he marked this board well before it was established as a nunnery. So why use the sign of the cross in his household? Again and again in all of Marlowe's plays, he shows his audiences religious labels, titles, symbols, figures that are absent of their religious meaning. It seems that Marlowe is intentionally undermining or reassigning a material value to religious markers. The cross has become the equivalent of X marks the spot, a simple indication of treasure. Barabbas' salvation is found not in religion, but in his fortune. When his money is taken from him, he calls himself a spirit or ghost. He has lost that which made him substantial. His soul's sole hope, he's very dramatic, is in reclaiming part of his wealth, or he warns that when I die, here shall my spirit walk. When Abigail throws down Barabbas' hidden wealth, she tells him to receive thy happiness. The religious parallel is clear as we can see Barabbas looking up, receiving bags of wealth from his daughter, as one might receive the Eucharist in a Catholic Mass. While the caste system is ruthlessly non-material, or at least it presents itself as spiritual and symbolic rather than material, before a mimetic system can be instituted, it might in fact be necessary to self-consciously engage in a state of materialism that is effectively social and worldly. Merlin Donald, in his remarkable book, Origins of the Modern Mind, ascertains that mimesis is fundamentally different from imitation and mimicry in that it involves the invention of intentional representation. Where there is an audience to interpret the action, mimesis also serves the purpose of social communication. In a caste system, representation is built on imitation, repeating what has been done to get the same outcome. Looking back to Cassell's catalog of elements of personhood, we see day-to-day activities and an awareness below existence. These are products of imitation. One does the same thing in the present that has been done in the past and will be done in the future. Caste doesn't call for reflection or intention. In fact, caste precludes reflection. In Cassell's catalog of features of personhood, rather than a list of items, Cassell has created categories of self and social reflection. Reflection is an important part of intentional representations. For mimesis, it needs not only to be seen, what happens in Malta, as Marlowe shows us, X marks the spot, but re-seen, what happens in Venice, as Shakespeare asks his audience to engage in the degradation of Shylock. There are two notions of reflection: the reflection of a mirror, which allows you to see only a version of what is, a single corresponding identity reflected on a proffered surface, and the activity of reflection, which necessitates repetition and an audience and allows apprehension beyond what is there to the possibility of what could be, a self and social reflection that we see in Venice. This double sense of reflection has been categorized by the neuroscientist Gerald Edelman in terms of primary consciousness and higher order consciousness. Primary consciousness, Edelman writes in his book, Wider Than the Sky, The Phenomenal Gift of Consciousness, is the state of being mentally aware of things in the world, of having mental images in the present. It is possessed not only by humans, but also by animals lacking semantic or linguistic capabilities, whose brain organization is nevertheless similar to ours. Primary consciousness is not accompanied by any sense of socially defined self with a concept of past or future. It exists primarily in the remembered present. In contrast, higher order consciousness involves the ability to be conscious of being conscious, and it allows the recognition of a thinking subject of his or her own acts and affections. At a minimal level, it requires semantic ability, that is, the assignment of meaning to symbol. In its most developed form, it requires linguistic ability, that is, the mastery of the whole system of symbols and a grammar. For Barabbas, X is symbolic only of its monetary value. His diamond daughter is only worth what he can get for her. And Barabbas himself is identified, not reflected upon, only by his present circumstances and current associates. In this, his sense of value is restricted to the remembered present. In the larger picture, the journey from the medieval Jew to the human Jew, Barabbas and Malta are a transitional site where Barabbas's surplus goods, wealth beyond need or future, are the ends rather than the means. In Merchant of Venice, we return to Leah's ring worth more than a wilderness of monkeys, a pound of flesh, and Shylock's conflation of my daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter. Many a critic has condemned Shylock in the courts of literary law based on these words. But I would argue that the ring, daughter and ducats debacle, and even the pound of flesh demonstrate that money is not salvation for Shylock as it is for Barabbas. For Barabbas, I would argue that wealth is the protection of his present self. But for Shylock, his wealth represents his future. It is the reason he confuses daughters and ducats. Shylock uses money as a symbolic value for agency, freedom, love, and loathing. At the end of the play, we see Shylock stripped of all his wealth and forced to convert. Shylock, at the end, echoes Antonio's earlier response to the bond, saying, I am content. Rather than an expression of acceptance, Shylock has become nothing but words, content. He has lost his symbolic meaning because it was tied to his wealth. This is a moment of reflection. We as audiences reflect on Shylock as Shylock is confronted by his loss of self. We as audience engage with the content and with Shylock, who is, after all, content. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, there's little to be said about Croxton's play of the Sacrament in terms of language. It's boring and straightforward. It's a play told. For the other two, language is far more interesting. As I mentioned previously, Gerard still puts Shakespeare's audience into castes, upper and groundlings, so he doesn't understand the new mimesis arising on Shakespeare's stage. Gerard understands Marlowe's secrets, coded intentions, veiled slights, but he cannot conceive of an audience that has agency. By his account, all agency belongs to the playwright. Perhaps by his theology, all agency belongs to the deity. Shakespeare's language is what we most associate with his prowess, and it's because of his ability to create in language what I'm calling a new mimesis, organized around or created by audience ownership and agency. Donald acknowledges that Eric Auerbach, in his book Mimesis, includes verbal discourse in as mimetic, even though mimesis is usually associated with action. Since it may be argued correctly, Donald said, that words are also used mimetically in a broader sense of formulating the shape of a myth or story and its attitude. He recognizes in the imagination, again, his words, a capacity to reconfigure the world in certain stylistic ways. But Donald doesn't take a moment to realize the enormity of his insight. After all, we learn this from Shakespeare. Imagination can reshape the world. Losing my place. Okay, we're almost there, I promise. All right. The inventive strategies that Shylock uses is mimesis. Michael Davis observes in his analysis of Aristotle's Poetics, which is to say, his analysis of theatrical language in ancient Greece, that in the medium of poetry, voice is not sound. It is not a being in its own right. To speak a voice means to have assumed something that speaks through voice, that has a voice. That we do not speak in voice, but through voice is perhaps the most fundamental sign of our natures as mimetic. Davis's is a modern analysis of mimesis. It is an analysis contrary to the revelatory pronouncements of medieval discourse and its organization around the absolutes of caste. That is, although Davis studies ancient tragedy, his analysis is fully tutored by Shakespeare and the Elizabethan stage. His sense of mimesis is something conceived of through artistic interaction and engagement with an audience that can never be understood in isolation, in the manner of Gerard. Davis speaks for us, which is to say he speaks for post-Shakespeareans. when he argues that for Aristotle, harmony was never said to be alone. Thus, he concludes something that is probably unthinkable in pre-Elizabethan medieval stage, namely that none of the original first things can stand by themselves. Mimesis is inferential in nature. It is the creation of meaning beyond that assigned to it, because again, it requires the audience and a wider sense of social discourse to play their parts. In the role of chorus, which is an audience incorporated into the very play, Shakespeare departs from the traditional chorus that tells the audience what to think, as in Oedipus Rex, to an unreliable chorus that asks the audience to engage and question. For this role, Shakespeare has cast Salerio and Salanio. The running commentary of Salerio and Salanio dictate our relationship with Shylock and Antonio. In Act 2, Scene 8, the entire scene revolves around these two figures and their perspectives, the public perspective, in the events of Shakespeare. Throughout their exchange, Shylock is referred to as villain Jew, dog Jew, while Antonio is referred to as good Antonio, a kinder gentleman, tread not the earth. In Act 3, Scene 1, Salanio speaks of the good Antonio, the honest Antonio. Oh, that I had a title good enough to keep his name company. And it is only when Salerio cuts him off that he stops his seemingly endless platitudes. How do we take these gross compliments? Even Salerio grows tired of them, which might indicate Shakespeare's expectations for his audience's fatigue. The view that Shakespeare gives us on Antonio and Shylock is the skewed, biased representation of the audience. It is towards these two men, whom I refer to as the Muppets, that Shylock's most renowned speech is directed. The placement of the speech speaks to the significance of these two seemingly interchangeable figures. Shylock responds to their abuse.
Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions?
Is this loud enough that you can hear it?
Senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?
Shakespeare is challenging the caricature that Salerio and Salanio have painted of Shylock, the public perception of the Jew. Shylock states to start, I am a Jew, right? Then the acknowledgement of difference is followed by a very uncomfortable unraveling of these differences. While the Muppets have illuminated the public's perception of these differences, Shylock shuts them down, emphasizing that they are the same. Shakespeare, through Shylock, presents us with a newly imagined mimetic world that allows us as audience to humanize the Jew villain, to give exactly what Cassell tells us makes a person. Shakespeare starts with the very body of the Jew, the hands, the organs. He then goes on to talk about how they see the world, dimensions and senses. Then he goes into emotional, referring to affections and passions. And finally, we come back to the transitive. He starts with the past tense and past participle, fed, hurt, healed, and then moves us to the supposition of commonality from human to human. If you prick us, if you tickle us, if you poison us. Here he articulates the possible if and the corresponding future, the inferential reality. It is here that we find what makes a human, the ability to laugh based on comprehension, and the recognition that we will die. Bloom recognizes what many do not. In Shakespeare, characters develop rather than unfold, and they develop because they reconceive themselves. Shylock creates or reconceives himself in this remarkable passage. He showcases the importance of imagination to infer future possibility. That is why Bloom said we made no advances on Shakespeare, because in 1598, Shakespeare was already saying what Cassell would not say again until 1991. Thank you. Bring me your questions, your queries, your thought-provoking comments.
So, in the caste system, there were obviously some Jews that had converted into Christianity. Would they have been still equal in the caste system as far as because they were Jewish originally? And are there any plays that show them in a different light?
That is a wonderful question. So Jews that converted were actually referred to by two names. One is the converso, which just means the converted. And then the other one is the Marrano, which means pig. Not the nicest term. But so Jews who converted were never truly accepted. Rodrigo Lopez, he didn't even convert. He was born into a converted family and was still killed as a Jew. So really the idea of they wanted Jews to convert, right? Because again, it would show kind of a Christian victory. But at the same time, they didn't want that to be a possibility because it also undermined the differences that existed between the two. So it was kind of a catch-22. Great question. Any other one?
Question, of course, I teach art history, so I think of the early 1400s very anti-Semitic paintings by Paolo Cello of Jews coming in and foiling the host and things like that. And those, to me, I never really thought of those as perhaps paintings of a theater. I mean, they looked like a theater setting, but all art did at that time period. But that time period is so difficult to kind of understand how performances looked. Do paintings document them? Is there any other documentation and so forth? Of course, that's much earlier, but then we get to like Caravaggio in 1600, and we go through humanism and so forth along the way, where you have greater kind of descriptive detail of humans in general. So does that just naturally lead them to Shakespeare when we start humanizing people, even in the visual arts, that suddenly we have to humanize these people that in the past we haven't humanized, and they just get swept into this kind of trend, or how do you see that?
That's a really good question. That was like a thought-provoking comment into a good question. So I think that's really interesting because the way that the Jew was seen changed so drastically. At first, it was like I showed earlier, way back in the beginning, that Semitic Satan, the horns, it was very much a creation of Satan as a Jewish representative. And then as it became more common on the stage, it seems like they wanted to make it more possible to create a costumed Jew without having to, go to all the kerfuffle of creating all of that. So they used things that they had lying around, like the nose, which has kind of unfortunately stuck for a very long time. But it was something that they had that was like, oh, I can use this to portray this character that I'm making a fool of anyway, because that was the foolish characteristic. But because that kept getting applied to the Jewish character, all of a sudden, we went from this devilish, figure to a giant nose. And so I think that as time changed and as theater changed, that altered the costume of the Jew and slowly started to shift them into something that is, as you said, more human looking, if not, still not pleasant. Any other questions?
I'm Jane Merchant. I'm also on the organizing committee, and I'm in the history department.
Oh, yay.
And kind of doing stuff with the Inquisition. So my question is related to dissimulation. in addition to everything you said about comparisons, the other thing that they were always sort of, the sneaky suspicion was that they were just faking being Christian for the tangible and monetary benefits of being Christian, and that they were, faking it. And
Yes.
secretly still practicing Judaism. So that's, another reason why the conversion was always like, okay, was it really real? But the other thing is, sort of England by Shakespeare's time now has a ton of Christians walking around who are also now engaging in varying practices of dissimulation. Church papists, the wrong kind of Protestant, so I'm just wondering if you think that either, if one experience on Shakespeare's part is making him more sympathetic to other, it's something wrong with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially because everybody's always like, what religion is he? And so, that was something that I wanted to talk about, but didn't have time to, is there's so much that we don't. Shakespeare was the master of mimesis, including himself. Everybody's like, we want to know about Marlowe? Great. Pick one of 500 books about it. If you want to know about Shakespeare, you get to look at who was Shakespeare really, or my favorite title, Our Elusive Willie, best title. But so with these, we get this idea of a person who is, in order to create himself, in order to become something more than he was born into, had to disassociate or disconnect himself from all of these different elements, including religion, right? Because a lot of people will say his family was Catholic originally, or at least his mother's family. And so watching that, going through the bloodshed and seeing that happen, I think it absolutely impacted how he viewed religion and how he put it on the stage. We can see it with Malvolio. We can see it with Shylock. A bunch of his plays showcase that religion where we're like, it's not as garish as Marlowe, who's like, let me see how much I can mock this, right? But that's why, Marlowe died amongst, 3 other spies in a very small house, and Shakespeare lived to be very, very wealthy and have the biggest house in all of Stratford-upon-Avon. Is his ability to mask himself. But that's a really good question.
It's interesting too, it said in Venice, not Rome, because Venice as a city was excommunicated by the Pope, and so it had its own kind of issues going on.
Yep. Yep. That's where that's where it all came, all the ghetto language came from, was from Venice, but yeah. Any other questions for me? Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you to the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies for helping us find speakers and put this on throughout the year. And also to the Norman Arts Council that helps fund this through our grant to the Medieval Fair Department. If anyone did not get a shirt at Medieval Fair this year, they are available online through Sunday. So if you want to order a shirt, a hat, or a mug, if you go to medievalfair.org, you'll be able to find the link that goes to Hard Edge, which is a local printer that we use. There's a pretty sure. Amy Kircher again. She's a great artist over at College of Fine Arts.
And thank you very much.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. Always happy to talk about Jews on the stage.